The summer festival was in full swing, filling the park with the sound of children laughing, carnival music playing, and the enticing aroma of cotton candy wafting through the air. Families wandered from stall to stall, soaking in the perfect day. But for one little girl, Sophie Lane, the day was about more than fun. It was about hope. Hope that she could, for a moment, forget her fragile reality and just be a kid like everyone else. Sophie, 9 years old, had a condition known as osteogenesis imperfecta, or brittle bone disease. Her tiny frame sat delicately in a wheelchair, adorned with colorful stickers of stars and flowers, reflecting her vibrant personality. Sophie knew her bones could break with even the slightest fall or jolt, but her spirit, that was unbreakable. She smiled brightly as her father, Jack Lane, a former Navy SEAL, watched from a nearby bench, his eyes filled with pride and love. Jack had seen his share of battles, both on the battlefield and at home. After losing his wife in a tragic accident, he had dedicated his life to protecting Sophie. Today was supposed to be a day of joy, a chance for his daughter to experience the laughter and magic that other kids enjoyed so effortlessly. But fate had other plans. As Sophie rolled her wheelchair along the gravel path toward the playground, a shadow loomed over her. A uniformed police officer, Officer Hank Carter, stood blocking her way. Tall and broad-shouldered, he was an imposing figure, and his stern expression made Sophie hesitate. "What do you think you're doing here?" His voice was cold, sharp, cutting through the cheerful chatter of the festival. Sophie's small voice trembled as she replied, I just want to go to the swings." The officer's eyes narrowed with disdain. "This isn't a place for people like you. Move along." Sophie's smile faltered, replaced by confusion and fear. The world around her seemed to fade as her chest tightened. But she didn't back down. With a shaky hand, she tried to maneuver her wheelchair to the side, determined to reach the playground. The officer stepped in front of her again, his voice rising. "I said move!" And then it happened. With a quick, cruel motion, he reached out and shoved Sophie's wheelchair backward. The sound of the chair's wheels scraping against the gravel silenced the laughter around them. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Sophie clutched the armrests, her knuckles white. She didn't cry. She never cried in public. But her wide eyes betrayed her shock and pain. From the bench, Jack's coffee cup hit the ground as he bolted to his feet. His heart raced with fury. He had fought to protect his country, but now he would fight for something even greater: his daughter. What happened next would change everything. This wasn't just an incident of cruelty. It was the spark of a movement. A moment that would unite a community and challenge a system. But the question remained: could justice prevail against the power of prejudice? Before we dive deeper into this gripping and emotional journey, do one thing for us. Like this video if you believe in standing up for the vulnerable. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the twists and turns of this incredible story. And most importantly, share this video to help spread the message of hope, courage, and justice. Let's begin. For as long as she could remember, Sophie Lane had been told to be careful. Every step, every move, every breath seemed to come with an invisible warning label. It wasn't because Sophie was clumsy or reckless. It was because her bones were as delicate as glass. Diagnosed with osteogenesis imperfecta, or brittle bone disease, Sophie had spent most of her young life balancing between caution and courage. At just 9 years old, Sophie had already experienced more hospital visits and surgeries than most people do in a lifetime. A small bump or fall that might leave a bruise on another child could shatter one of Sophie's bones. But despite the countless casts and the ever-present wheelchair, Sophie refused to let her condition define her. "I'm not fragile," she often declared with a smile, "just unique." Her father, Jack Lane, was her anchor in every storm. A retired Navy SEAL, Jack was no stranger to adversity. He had faced dangerous missions in distant lands, survived situations where others would have faltered, and lost comrades who had become like brothers. But nothing had tested his strength more than being Sophie's dad. Jack had become a single father 3 years ago after losing his wife Clara in a car accident. Clara had been the heart of their family, a kind, adventurous woman who had adored Sophie and believed in nurturing her independence. After her death, Jack had taken on both roles, protector and nurturer, balancing his military instincts with Clara's gentle wisdom. Every morning, Jack would help Sophie into her wheelchair, but it was Sophie who taught him how to navigate the world through her lens. Her resilience inspired him, her laughter healed him, and her unyielding determination kept him going even on the hardest days. The Lane household was a mix of military precision and childlike chaos. Jack's meticulous schedule, born from years of disciplined training, was often interrupted by Sophie's bursts of creativity. The dining table was never just for eating. It doubled as Sophie's art studio, where she painted bright, whimsical worlds that seemed to dance across her canvases. Her room was a haven of colors and textures, with fairy lights draped over her bed and walls covered in her favorite quotes. "Dad, do you think unicorns are real?" Sophie had asked one evening, her small hands covered in paint. Jack had smiled, setting down the book he was reading. "If anyone could find a unicorn, Soph, it'd be you." Their relationship was a beautiful contradiction. Jack's protective instincts often clashed with Sophie's adventurous spirit. She wanted to experience everything: new foods, new places, new friends, while Jack constantly worried about her safety. Yet they found balance in their shared love of storytelling. Jack would regale Sophie with tales of his time in the Navy, transforming his missions into bedtime stories where he was a knight battling dragons. In return, Sophie would share the fantastical adventures of her art, weaving stories about brave girls who faced impossible odds. And still, life wasn't without its challenges. Sophie's condition often drew stares and whispers from strangers, which she pretended not to notice. But Jack noticed. He saw the fleeting shadow of hurt cross her face when other kids avoided her or when adults spoke to her as if she were younger than her age. It was moments like these that reminded Jack why he had left the military. Sophie needed someone who could fight for her, both in her world and against the world. Despite the challenges, Jack made it a point to create moments of pure joy for Sophie. Movie nights with too much popcorn, camping trips in the backyard under a blanket of stars, and impromptu karaoke sessions were their escape from the realities of brittle bones and hospital appointments. He wanted Sophie to know that she could be happy, even when life wasn't easy. For Sophie, Jack was her superhero. Not because of his Navy SEAL past, but because of the way he looked at her, with pride, love, and an unwavering belief in her strength. And for Jack, Sophie was his reason to keep going, his light in the darkness. As the festival day approached, Jack had promised Sophie a day she'd never forget. The swings at the park had always been her favorite, and Sophie couldn't wait to feel the rush of air on her face as she soared back and forth. It wasn't just a trip to the playground. It was a symbol of her independence, a reminder that she could still touch the sky, even from her wheelchair. That morning, Sophie had carefully picked out her outfit, complete with a glittery headband that made her feel like a princess. "Do you think the swings will still be as fun as I remember?" she asked Jack as he helped her into the car. Jack smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think they'll be even better, Soph." As they drove to the park, the excitement in Sophie's voice filled the car, and Jack couldn't help but smile. Today was going to be perfect. Or so he thought. The sun hung high in the sky as Sophie and Jack arrived at the bustling park, the warm summer air filled with laughter, music, and the cheerful sounds of children playing. Sophie's face lit up as her wheelchair rolled across the smooth pathway. For her, this was more than just a day at the park. It was a chance to feel normal, to lose herself in the joy that so many other kids seemed to take for granted. "Dad, look at that!" Sophie exclaimed, pointing to a brightly colored carousel spinning in the distance. Her excitement was infectious, and Jack couldn't help but smile. "We'll stop by there later," he promised, adjusting the small backpack slung over his shoulder, filled with water, snacks, and Sophie's favorite sketchpad. "But first, to the swings." Sophie nodded eagerly. The swings had always been her favorite. To her, swinging was like flying, a brief escape from the constraints of her fragile body. As they made their way toward the playground, Sophie noticed a group of kids running past, their carefree laughter trailing behind them. Her smile faltered for a moment, a shadow of longing flickering in her eyes, but it quickly returned. Sophie wasn't one to dwell on what she could do. She focused on what she could. Jack noticed the momentary shift in her expression, his heart tightening. He was always attuned to these small signs, the unspoken reminders of how different Sophie's world was. He reached down and squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're going to show those swings who's boss," he said, his voice filled with pleasantries. Sophie giggled. "I always do." As they approached the playground, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a work email, something minor but requiring his attention. "Go ahead, Soph," he said, gesturing toward the swings. "I'll catch up in a minute." "Okay, Dad," Sophie chirped, rolling her chair forward with renewed excitement. Jack stayed back, quickly typing a response, but his eyes never left Sophie. He watched as she navigated the path toward the swings, her wheelchair moving with practiced precision. To him, Sophie was the epitome of resilience. She had faced more challenges in her 9 years than most adults ever would, yet she met each day with an unbreakable spirit. But as Sophie neared the swings, something shifted in the air. A uniformed police officer stood near the playground entrance, his tall, broad-shouldered frame cutting an imposing figure against the cheerful backdrop of the festival. His name tag read, H. Carter, and his expression was stern, almost annoyed, as he scanned the crowd. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her hands pausing on the wheels of her chair. The officer hadn't done anything yet, but there was something about his presence that made her uneasy. She pushed forward anyway, determined not to let her nerves get the better of her. The swings were right there, just a few feet away. As Sophie moved closer, Officer Carter's eyes landed on her, his brows furrowing. He stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Hold on there," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Where do you think you're going?" Sophie blinked up at him, startled. "To the swings," she said softly, her voice steady but unsure. Carter frowned, his gaze sweeping over her wheelchair. This area isn't safe for your kind. You need to move along. My kind? Sophie repeated, her confusion evident. But it's a playground. It's for everyone. The officer's frown deepened. Not today, he said firmly. Find somewhere else to play. Sophie's chest tightened, and she looked around, hoping someone might step in, but the other parents and children nearby seemed hesitant, unsure of how to react. Sophie took a deep breath, her small hands tightening on the wheels of her chair. I have as much right to be here as anyone, she said, her voice trembling but brave. Carter's face darkened. Don't make me repeat myself, he snapped. Back near the bench, Jack had noticed the exchange. His stomach knotted as he watched the officer step closer to Sophie, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. Jack's instincts flared, years of military training kicking in as he recognized the situation escalating. He abandoned his phone and started moving toward his daughter, his strides quick and purposeful. Is there a problem here? Jack's voice cut through the tension as he approached. His tone was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. Carter turned to face Jack, his stern expression faltering for a moment when he met the former Navy SEAL's piercing gaze. This area isn't suitable for someone like her, the officer said, gesturing towards Sophie. I'm just ensuring safety. Safety isn't the issue, Jack replied, stepping closer until he was standing protectively beside Sophie. The issue is you blocking her from enjoying the playground like every other kid here. Carter bristled, his posture stiffening. I'm just doing my job. Jack's jaw tightened. He leaned down and placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie, you okay? He asked gently. Sophie nodded, but her eyes were wide, and Jack could feel the tension in her small frame. I just wanted to go to the swings, she whispered. Jack straightened, his gaze locking onto Carter's. Then that's exactly what she's going to do. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Jack's unyielding stance seemed to give him pause. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the air thick with tension. Around them, festival-goers began to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they realized what was happening. Come on, Soph, Jack said finally, his voice steady but firm. He gently guided her wheelchair past Carter, ignoring the officer's glare. The crowd parted, their eyes following the pair as Jack pushed Sophie toward the swings. Sophie glanced up at her father, her lips trembling. Thanks, Dad, she said quietly. Jack knelt beside her, his voice soft. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. You're stronger than they'll ever know. As Sophie's wheelchair reached the swings, Jack helped her transfer onto the seat, his hand steady and sure. He pushed her gently, the sound of her laughter ringing out once more. For now, the world felt right again. But Jack couldn't shake the unease that lingered in his chest. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The ride home from the park was quiet. Sophie sat in the back seat of the car, her hands resting on the armrest of her wheelchair. She gazed out the window, her reflection in the glass, a mixture of exhaustion and contemplation. The joy of the day had been overshadowed by the confrontation with Officer Carter. The cruel words, the judgment, and the fear lingered in her mind like shadows she couldn't shake. Jack glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. His heart aching at the sight of her normally bright demeanor dimmed. He had seen Sophie face pain before. Broken bones, hospital stays, moments of frustration. But this was different. This wasn't a battle against her body. It was a battle against a world that had failed to see her as the incredible, capable person she was. As they pulled into the driveway of their small but cozy home, Jack spoke softly. "Hey, Soph, want me to make those pancakes you like for dinner?" Sophie turned to him, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, with the chocolate chips?" "With extra chocolate chips," Jack promised. Sophie's smile widened slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Jack knew she was trying to be strong for him, just as he was trying to be strong for her. But tonight, he wasn't going to let her carry the weight alone. Later that evening, as Sophie worked on a new painting at the dining table, Jack sat across from her, his coffee untouched. The vibrant colors she used, a swirling mix of blues, purples, and yellows, were a stark contrast to her earlier silence. Her brush moved with practiced ease, but Jack could sense her thoughts were elsewhere. "Sophie," he said gently, breaking the quiet, "do you want to talk about what happened today?" Her brush paused mid-stroke. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with emotions she hadn't yet put into words. "Why did he hate me, Dad?" Jack's chest tightened. He had prepared for many questions as a parent, but this one cut deeper than any he'd faced before. He set down his mug and leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Didn't hate you, sweetheart," Jack said, choosing his words carefully. "But sometimes people let their fear or ignorance cloud their judgment. They see someone who's different, and instead of trying to understand, they push them away." Sophie looked down at her painting. "I wasn't hurting anyone. I just wanted to play." "I know," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you did nothing wrong. You are brave, Soph, and kind and strong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." She nodded, but Jack could see the lingering doubt in her eyes. He reached out, covering her small hand with his. "I'm proud of you," he said, "for standing up for yourself, for being the amazing person you are." "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack sat back, his mind racing. What happened today wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something bigger, a system that allowed people like Carter to abuse their authority without consequence. He had always taught Sophie to be strong, to face the world with courage, but today had made him realize that wasn't enough. She needed more than his protection. She needed justice. That night, as Sophie slept in her room, Jack sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. The videos from the park confrontation were already circulating online, shared by strangers who had witnessed the scene. The comments flooded in, expressions of outrage, support for Sophie, and calls for accountability. Jack scrolled through the messages, his jaw tightening with each one. One message stood out. "This isn't just about your daughter. It's about every child who's ever been made to feel small because of who they are. Speak up. Fight back." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the events of the day. He had always kept his life as a Navy SEAL separate from his role as a father, but the skills he'd honed in the military, leadership, strategy, resolve, were exactly what he needed now. This wasn't just about protecting Sophie anymore. It was about making sure no other child had to endure what she had. He made a decision that night, a decision born from love and determination. Jack would fight, not with fists or weapons, but with his voice, his story, and his unshakable belief in justice. He would take on the system, the prejudice, the ignorance, and he wouldn't stop until the world was a better place for Sophie and every child like her. The next morning, Jack woke early, his mind clear and focused. He began making phone calls, first to a lawyer he trusted, then to local advocacy groups that worked for the rights of disabled individuals. By the time Sophie woke up, Jack had already scheduled meetings, drafted emails, and contacted the media. As Sophie rolled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, Jack greeted her with a warm smile. "Mornin', champ. How do pancakes sound for breakfast?" Sophie grinned. "With extra chocolate chips." "With extra chocolate chips," he confirmed, flipping the batter onto the hot skillet. Over breakfast, Jack explained his plan. "We're not just going to let this go, Soph. What happened to you wasn't right, and it's time we made sure people know that." Sophie's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" "We're going to tell your story," Jack said, "and we're going to make sure no one forgets it." "But what if it doesn't change anything?" she asked hesitantly. Jack leaned forward, his voice steady. "It will. Because we're not just fighting for you. We're fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. And when we fight together, we're unstoppable." Sophie looked at her dad, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." That day marked the beginning of a new battle for Jack Lane. A battle not for survival, but for justice. He used his platform as a retired Navy SEAL to draw attention to Sophie's story, appearing on news programs, speaking at community events, and rallying support from people across the country. The videos from the park became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about inclusivity, fairness, and the power of standing up for what's right. Through it all, Sophie remained his inspiration. Her courage, her kindness, and her unwavering spirit reminded Jack why he had to keep fighting. And as father and daughter faced the world together, they proved that even the smallest voices could make the biggest impact. The news of Sophie's story had spread like wildfire. What started as a few videos shared online had turned into a national movement. People from all walks of life rallied behind Sophie and Jack, demanding accountability not just for Officer Carter's actions, but for the systemic prejudices faced by people with disabilities. Community leaders organized a rally in the heart of the city, turning the small confrontation at the park into a beacon of hope and change. Jack hesitated at first, unsure about putting Sophie in the spotlight. But Sophie, in her quiet yet firm way, convinced him otherwise. "Dad," she said one evening as they sat in the living room, "if we don't tell people, how will they ever understand? This isn't just about me." Jack stared at her, his heart swelling with pride. Sophie's bravery never ceased to amaze him. "All right," he said with a nod. "Let's do this together." The day of the rally was overcast, the sky heavy with gray clouds, as if reflecting the weight of the fight ahead. Jack and Sophie arrived early, greeted by a sea of supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for Sophie" and "End discrimination now." Some signs bore quotes from Sophie's own words, like, "I just wanted to swing." Jack's throat tightened at the sight of strangers rallying around his daughter, their faces filled with determination and empathy. As they made their way through the crowd, people reached out to shake Jack's hand or crouched down to speak to Sophie. One little girl in a wheelchair rolled up beside Sophie, her shy smile mirroring the gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for standing up for us," she said softly, her mother standing behind her, with tears in her eyes. Sophie grinned, her own nervousness fading. "We're standing up together," she replied. Jack knelt beside the two girls, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is why we're here," he said, looking from Sophie to the little girl and her mother. "To make sure every child can feel safe, included, and valued." The rally began with speeches from local advocates and activists. Each one spoke about the challenges faced by the disabled community and the urgent need for change. Jack stood to the side of the stage, his hand resting protectively on Sophie's shoulder as they listened. Finally, it was Jack's turn. As he stepped up to the podium, the crowd erupted into applause. Sophie stayed at his side, her small hand clutching the edge of his jacket. Jack took a deep breath, scanning the faces before him. He had faced enemy lines and impossible odds during his years as a Navy SEAL, but nothing compared to the weight of speaking for his daughter and others like her. "Thank you for being here today," Jack began, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "I'm not standing here as a former soldier or a decorated veteran. I'm standing here as a father who watched his little girl be told she didn't belong." The crowd fell silent, every ear tuned to his words. "Sophie," he said, glancing down at her with a smile, "is the bravest person I know. She has faced challenges most of us can't even imagine, and she does it with a strength that humbles me every day. But what happened at that park was not about her condition. It was about ignorance, about a failure to see her as the amazing, capable person she is." Jack paused, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. "We cannot allow that ignorance to go unchecked. We cannot let another child feel the fear and humiliation that Sophie felt that day. This is not just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, but Jack wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice rising with passion. "It's time to hold people accountable. It's time to demand better, not just for Sophie, but for every child, every person who has ever been told they don't belong. This is our fight, and it doesn't end here." Jack stepped back, the roar of the crowd washing over him. He glanced at Sophie, who was beaming up at him, her eyes shining with pride. For the first time since that day in the park, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her, but for the world they were trying to change. As the rally continued, the atmosphere became electric, with a sense of unity and purpose. Activists shared stories of their own experiences. Parents spoke about their hopes for their children, and young people with disabilities took the stage to demand their voices be heard. Sophie listened intently, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and resolve. At one point, a young woman in her early 20s approached Sophie and Jack. She introduced herself as Emily, a law student who had grown up with brittle bone disease, just like Sophie. "I used to feel so alone," Emily said, crouching beside Sophie's wheelchair. "But seeing you here today standing tall makes me believe we can create a better world." Sophie's face lit up. "We can, together." Emily smiled, tears brimming in her eyes as she turned to Jack. "Thank you for fighting for her. For us." Jack nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "We'll keep fighting." The climax of the rally came when Sergeant Martinez, the officer who had intervened at the park, stepped onto the stage. Her presence surprised the crowd, and a murmur spread as she approached the microphone. "I'm here today," Martinez began, "not as a police officer, but as a person who believes in justice. What happened at that park was unacceptable, and it's my responsibility as a member of law enforcement and as a human being to stand with you in calling for change." Her words were met with applause, and Martinez continued, Accountability isn't just about punishing one individual. It's about acknowledging our failures and committing to do better. And I promise you, I will do everything in my power to ensure that happens." Jack nodded in approval, his respect for Martinez growing. It wasn't easy to stand up against one's own, but her actions showed that real change was possible. As the rally drew to a close, Jack knelt beside Sophie, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You did it, Soph," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You showed the world how strong you are." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes shining with determination. "We did it, Dad, and we're not done yet." Jack chuckled, pulling her close. "No, kiddo, we're just getting started." The rally ended with a chant that echoed through the city streets. "Justice for Sophie! Justice for all!" For Jack and Sophie, it was more than a slogan. It was a promise. The days following the rally were a whirlwind for Jack and Sophie. The overwhelming support from people all over the country had turned their personal battle into a national conversation. Social media flooded with hashtags like "Justice for Sophie" and "End Ableism," while news outlets covered their story, amplifying their message. For Jack, it was both humbling and empowering. Every message of support, every shared story from families facing similar struggles reminded him why they had chosen to fight. But amidst the media attention and community efforts, Jack never lost sight of the most important thing: Sophie. She was the reason he had taken on this fight, and she was the light that guided him through every challenge. One quiet evening, after the frenzy of interviews and phone calls had died down, Jack and Sophie sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sophie was sketching in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration as her pencil moved across the page. "What are you working on, champ?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. Sophie smiled without looking up. "It's a surprise." Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the cool evening breeze wash over him. For the first time in weeks, things felt calm. "You've been incredible through all of this," he said after a moment. "I know it hasn't been easy." Sophie paused her drawing and looked up at him, her eyes thoughtful. "It's been scary," she admitted. "But it's also been kind of amazing. All those people, Dad, they stood up for me, for us." Jack nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "They did, because you showed them what courage looks like." Sophie tilted her head, her expression curious. "Do you think things will really change?" Jack took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "Change takes time," he said, finally. "But I believe this is the start of something bigger. And what you did, Sophie, you made people see things differently. That's how change begins." Sophie's face lit up with a small, hopeful smile. "Then I think it was worth it." "It was," Jack said, his voice steady. "And I'm proud of you, more than words can say." The legal proceedings against Officer Carter moved swiftly. The evidence from the bystander videos, combined with testimonies from witnesses, painted a damning picture of his actions. The court ruled in favor of disciplinary action, and Carter was removed from his position. It wasn't the end of the systemic issues they were fighting, but it was a step forward, a victory that symbolized accountability. Jack and Sophie also became advocates for broader reform. They worked with local officials to push for new policies aimed at educating public servants about disabilities and inclusivity. Sophie, with her bright smile and heartfelt words, became a symbol of resilience for the community. She even spoke at a town hall meeting, her voice steady, as she shared her story. "I'm not different because I'm in a wheelchair," she said, her eyes scanning the audience. "I'm just like you. I want to play, to laugh, to belong, and that's what everyone deserves." Her words moved the room to tears, including Jack, who stood at the back, his pride evident in every line of his face. As life began to settle into a new rhythm, Jack and Sophie found ways to balance their advocacy work with the simple joys they cherished. Movie nights, painting sessions, and backyard camping trips became their refuge from the weight of their mission. Sophie's laughter, brighter and freer than ever, filled their home once more. One evening, as Jack tucked Sophie into bed, she handed him the notebook she had been drawing in. "Here," she said, her voice shy but excited. "I finished it." Jack opened the notebook to find a drawing of the two of them standing together at the rally. In Sophie's unique style, she had captured the moment with vibrant colors and bold lines. Above their heads, she had written the words, "Change starts with us." Jack's throat tightened as he looked at the drawing, his heart swelling with pride and love. "This is beautiful, Soph," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining. "Do you think it will make a difference?" "It already has," Jack said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "And so have you." Sophie and Jack's journey isn't just their story. It's a story for all of us. It's a reminder that no matter how small or powerless we may feel, our voices matter. Sophie's courage and Jack's determination sparked a movement, but it's the collective power of people like you that drives real change. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to join us in making a difference. Like this video if you believe in standing up for justice and equality. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story. And most importantly, share this video to spread the message that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and the right to belong. Let's continue Sophie's mission together, because as Sophie said, change starts with us.